There, thanks for taking the trouble to come out tonight. So I have a presentation which I'm keen to throw at your feet, which is called Atemporality for Media Philosophers. And when I come to EGS, as I kind of do surprisingly often, I usually come here to complain a lot, but also like beg for help. Like last time I was here, if you go back and look at the videos that people are now keen to make, I brought a lot of pictures, and these were pictures that had qualities that seemed troublingly wrong to me, and I called them atemporal, and they were just kind of evocative images that suggested some kind of sensibility. Well, many months have passed since I did this earlier presentation, and my thinking has, well, I hate to say it's advanced, but maybe it's kind of mutated. And I finally realized when I was coming up here again that this is the first time I have arrived at a European graduate school with a problem that really is best described as a media philosophy problem. That struck me as unusual and fun because, EGS is known for media philosophy. And many people question whether such a thing could exist, much like cyberpunk and so forth. But I really do have some issues, about problems and opportunities in the philosophy of history and futurism, and they are problems that are very deeply tied in with our rapidly changing, sometimes advancing, sometimes collapsing media environment. They're problems of philosophy and problems of media, and they're problems of meaning, and they're problems of narrative. And I'm really wrestling with them. And I feel like these problems are coming to some kind of head. So let me see if I can make these clear. Okay, so history and futurism are disciplines, and all disciplines, including history and futurism, are time-bound. I mean, they have histories, and they have origins, and they have apparent destinations. And history has a history. And even the history of history has a history. And the future has a history. There's a paleo future. And it's really a pretty large paleo future now. I mean, it's not as large as the history of history, but the history of futurity is really kind of getting big and difficult to get your head around. So one critic once described the effort of science fiction or science fiction writing in the following way: to historicize the present as the past of a future yet to be in an anticipation of retrospection. Right? And I think that's actually a pretty good game plan. I mean, to historicize the present as the past of a future yet to be in an anticipation of retrospection. Now, the only problem with that sentence is it's like 18 kinds of oxymoron. But it's also an intensely science fictional sentence because it really is cutting to the chase of an idea of a mutation, a temporal mutation in society that allows us to write about future events in the past tense. And to bring really a kind of historical narrative about events that are merely speculative and may not work at all or are just set in a future perspective. And this is not something that our society did or that any society did for a long time. It's something that basically came up pretty much out of nowhere. And the late 1600s really went pretty much kind of nowhere after that until at least the early 1800s, and has now reached some kind of, an atemporal state is the best word I've got for it. So, what is history? And what is history made of? I mean, what is our writing about history made of as opposed to just objective facts about the passage of time that happened behind us? Well, history is an effort in the humanities. It's about trying to understand causes and circumstances and, what went wrong and what was good and what was bad and so forth and so on. It's a literary effort, and history is conveyed to us through a medium of analog print artifacts. That's what we have from the past, and they're mostly artifacts from literate institutions. Institutions that are big enough to publish and to preserve what they have published, which means religious orders. So we've got a lot of scriptures around, tons of them, heaps of them, and states. And statistics come from states. So if you're looking into the past, you want to know what went on, it's very common to just go into the statistical heaps instead of see what was brought to us by religion and power. And we don't hear a lot from other phenomena of the past because there were limits to the means of production and distribution, and especially limits to the means of storage, because as time passed, stuff just becomes ephemeral and it just burns up or falls over or rots. And we've lost a lot of data that way. I mean, we've got diaries, which are of some use, and poetry and folk songs, and there's some legends and the occasional personal testament. But, the general urge in writing history has been to write for and about nation states and for mass audiences that are addressed through a paper publishing platform. And this never occurred. It never occurred to us until recently that there was anything odd about this, or that there would be a lacuna there. I mean, history was about what the state was doing. I mean, what kind of powerful decisions were made by people in power. And, what was our own linguistic and ethnic group doing? Who was using our language? Who was reading our language, our historical testaments? And that's really looking under the lamp, because that's where the light of the past is. I mean, you're searching where you have evidence. That's where history is. So there are historiographies, written histories about nation, maybe about zeitgeist, the feeling of the period, or class, or nationalisms or imperialisms, or the triumph of the bourgeoisie, what they call teleological trajectories of history. There's a reason it's like going here, and it's like a purpose, and it's like achieving some higher end. It's the had to be of the progressive discourse. It had to be like that because it was becoming something that we like. The had to be of the progressive discourse. History as the metaphysical horizon of our knowledge of the human race. Like, we can invent all kinds of things and have all kinds of ideas that we invent ourselves, but if we want to know what we've been up to all this time and what dead people are up to, we really don't have any place else to look but history. The judgment of history. Why is history judging anything? I mean, that's like an implicit theological statement that history has an ability to judge. It dates back to the days when literature was the national religion and critics were like its theologians. History and literature on paper is the saga of the emergent identity of a nation and a people. Historical novels, like the billboards of romantic nationalism, Sir Walter Scott, so forth, Alessandro Manzoni. You can read these novels from the early days of the nation state. They're all about the past, but they're all one long insistence that the British are a people, or the Italians are a people, or that the readers are a people, and that the nation is sort of the mystical identification of the people. Foucault used to say that discourse speaks us and not the other way around. And I really think historical novels of the early 19th century are probably the purest example of that ever. Romantic historical nationalism, this grand narrative of progress and liberation. That's the ultimate discourse-speaking literature. And reading it nowadays, and I do, it's really impossible to escape that feeling. People have tried to get away from this for a long time. I mean, it's not news to hear that the narrative of history has come under question. I mean, it's more than come under question. It's actually been progressively disintegrated. I mean, they've really tried to get away from the logocentricity of history and from the nationalism of history and from the sort of narratives of power and faith They've tried to include the formerly excluded. They've tried to move into an identity politics of minor histories or local histories or multiple histories, like gender history, race history, sexual histories, literary criticisms about the narratives and the rhetorics of historical writing. There's just a ton of this around, especially since the late 70s. There's been a lot of analysis of the ways that specific social realities get constructed by texts from schools, courts, political movements, from science, from warfare, from civil rights. There's an attempt to get away from narratives of history and sort of rebuild a cultural history that's based in practices that are obscure and local and minor. But I really think that with the origin of today's network culture, and I don't know what else to call it, but the current media environment, the emergent new media environment, it really gives us a chance to reevaluate our attitudes toward history and futurity. We don't really get a choice about doing this because it really is violently changing the means by which we explain ourselves to ourselves. We're really not going to be able to take any refuge in text. The way we historically transmit our patterns of meaning is changing, and we will never be able to go back to the old ways. I mean, postmodernism calls the narrative into question. Network culture messes up the narrative so radically, so hard, so thoroughly. It splinters it. It turns it into an insidious flow of micro-mediated, hyperlinked particles. It's going to be impossible to get that back. It's just gone. And that's the atemporal condition. Now, as someone of my generation, I'm very keen on chipping away at the narrative, because when I was young, there used to be one. But I don't think that's the situation as it stands right now, and I want to see if I could get a little deeper into that. Now, they say that the postmodern way of writing history is to avoid the master narrative and look for odd anecdotal starting points and strange juxtapositions. I'm extremely keen on that. I mean, that's sort of like science fiction writer job one, to look for odd anecdotal starting points and strange juxtapositions. We're very keen on that. And then these pictures I was showing, my pictures that seem to describe an atemporal sensibility, they really were there to impart a stronger sense of the unpresentable, as Lyotard used to say. I mean, I didn't realize this till I realized that Lyotard wanted people to impart a stronger sense of the unpresentable. Yeah. With those pictures, I was very, very keen to present a stronger sense of the unpresentable. Now, you can argue against my idea that networked culture is pulling narratives apart or chopping them up or remixing them. Zizek says otherwise. I mean, he says that we do have grand ideological narratives, and he says we have 4 of them, and that they really are sort of logocentric and kind of very well thought out and kind of have an arrow of time and have a very sort of clear manifest destiny air about them. And he says there are 4 of them. Number 1 is Christian fundamentalism. Number 2, New Age spirituality. Number 3, techno-digital post-humanism. And number 4, secular ecologism. He may be right. I'm not real thrilled with any 4 of those ideological narratives, and I think with the passage of time, they're probably going to reveal a lot of their underlying brotherhood. I mean, they're all children of a particular epoch, and they all have a certain taint of the profoundly irrational about them. And I don't think any one of those is going to get us out of the actual difficulties that we face. So, I'm feeling conflicted about my long romance with the rhizomatic subversions of postmodern culture. And, I am a novelist, and I'm not really a philosopher, but, philosophy affects literature, and so, I'm kind of I don't know, a folk postmodernist in that way, and I don't really have a difficulty with the rhizomatic subversions of postmodern culture. I kind of feel kindly toward them and consider them sort of amusing and like great material for me, but I really feel like we've stepped over the edge of something. And I don't know when that happened, but, well, let me just read some things that William Gibson said, because in some ways he's more eloquent than I, and he also talks about the term atemporality, and it's an itch that he and I as fellow practitioners kind of suffer a lot. He talks about our increasingly efficient communal prosthetic memory, which is what network culture is to him. Like our increasingly efficient communal prosthetic memory. Why do I look something up in a history book when I can just Google it? Why? Why would I ever look anything up in a history book again unless I was forced to do it? It's just so slow. And I don't get to cross-link it to other things. And it's not generated by large numbers of people. It's written by some one guy. Why? I mean, even if he's got 1 million footnotes in the back, why do I trust him to do anything that's of any use to me ever? So here's Gibson describing his new novel, Zero History, the only too aptly titled, Zero History. The future with a capital F, be it crystalline city on the hill or radioactive post-nuclear wasteland, is gone. Ahead of us there is merely more stuff. Some tending to the crystalline, some to the wastelandy. Stuff. The mixed bag of the quotidian. This newfound state of no future is, in my opinion, a very good thing. It indicates a kind of maturity, an understanding that every future is someone else's past, every present someone else's future. Upon arriving at the capital F future, we discover it invariably to be the lowercase now. So here's Nicholas Brio speaking, art guy, event organizer, gallerist, critic. He talks about the alter modern. And what's the alter modern? Well, the historical period defined by postmodernism is coming to an end. Multiculturalism and the discourse of identity, he says, is being overtaken by a planetary movement of creolization. Postmodernism encloses artistic phenomena in origins and identities. Alter-modern artists translate and transcode information from one format to another and wander in geography as well as in history. This gives rise to practices which might be referred to as time-specific. So he's trying to argue. Let me see if I can parse that a little bit. I mean, I don't want to like distort the guy's rather eloquent artistic statement here, but let me just tell you how that rings on my ear. I mean, the planetary movement of creolization, yeah, I think that's a real phenomena. Postmodernism encloses artistic phenomena and origins and identities. I think that's true too. On the network, it's much harder to find out who invented something, where it came from, where it's going, where it's being stored, who came up with it, what their nationality was, what the circumstances were under which they produced it. I mean, there's a planetary movement of creolization in that people actually move, like I'm here in Switzerland as opposed to being in Austin, Texas. But there's also a movement of just the data. Because you don't know its origin. You found it on a search engine. It was on Flickr. It was on Twitter. It was in a reference site somewhere. I mean, it really strips away origins and identities from the data. Translating and transcoding information from one format to another, you know, I see that every day. I mean, the boundaries between media really are breaking down. I mean, I do it every day. I can see it in my blog. My blog used to be very text heavy, then it got more and more hyperlinks in it. Then there were links to other people's blogs. Lately there's lots of video in my blog. I don't doubt I'll have some augmented reality in my blog pretty soon. You're kind of led step by step by the capacity of these devices and the networks that support them to just follow the meltdown of media into the logical spaces of new media. No, it's not an accident that Paul's sitting here, that he does this every damn day. I mean, you want to talk about translating and transcoding information from one format to another? Yeah, I don't think he's ever done anything else in his entire career. Wandering in geography as well as in history, yeah. You know, mea culpa, him too. Practices that might be referred to as time-specific, yeah, okay, they're different. They're not really part of any particular epic. They've got pieces of other epics that are mixed in them. Kazis Varnelis, he's an architecture critic. I'm a big fan of his, spent a lot of time hanging out with him. He more or less coined the term network culture. When I refer to network culture, I think of many of the things he said. What does he say about it? The digital era, and he means the past digital era, is marked by the desktop computer, displaying information from a heavy, fixed CRT monitor connected to the network via a dial-up modem. You know, there aren't a lot of those around. I mean, really, there aren't a lot of those around, and they're looking about as archaic as a Remington Ball typewriter. I mean, they're just kind of going. The portable notebook, laptop, netbook, or smartphone has taken over, used through wireless broadband networks in the office, at school, in bed, on the train, in the plane. Digital culture, which is dead or dying, digital culture wanted a universal computing device. Network culture seeks the ubiquitous mobile cloud of densely connected social metamedia. Okay, those may seem like technical distinctions. I don't think they're technical. I think they're distinctions of practically everything you can name. I mean, practice, artistic practice, governance, literature, the military, it's all up for grabs. So let me try and drill down a little bit. I mean, how does this work out in real life? I mean, these are sort of interesting abstract remarks, kind of redolent of doom almost. Suppose that I'm really interested in history and I want to know what happened during 1944 in Switzerland. Well, my immediate reaction as a network culture person is to ask Google. What does Google say about what happened in 1944 in Switzerland? What Google says about what happened in 1944 in Switzerland is not the same thing as I would find out about Switzerland from previous sources like the library, spending a few months hunting down old newsreels. It's not what I would find out from my operating system. It's not what I would find out by using keywords. It's not what I would find out by searching my own desktop for material I used to have about Switzerland and I've forgotten that I had, or hints from my social network about what might have happened in Switzerland in 1944. We will not be going back to that early way of knowledge. Not any more than you go back to the banking system of Switzerland in 1944. It's just gone. I mean, suppose I'm a philosopher. You know, and I'm a young philosopher. I'm 18 years old. I don't have a lot of experience yet. Just grew up in the modern era. Somebody asked me the Socratic question, what is justice? You talk about justice a lot. What is justice? Well, you know, I might read some texts on the subject. I might ask a professor at law school. I might decide I'm going to major in law or the philosophy of law. I might look for a reading list of noted scholars who've considered this topic. Or I might try a completely different set of approaches. Step one, write about justice in a search engine. See what Wikipedia has to say about it. Step two, write the problem in my blog. Study the commentary cross-link from other people. Step three, write about justice in Twitter in 140 characters. See if I can get my concern that small. See if it gets retweeted. Step four, open source my justice problem. Just explain to everybody that I've got a real problem about justice. Supply all the instructables that got me this far, what I've managed to scrape up about justice. See if the community takes the effort any farther. Step five, start a social network about my justice problem. Name the network Justice. See if anybody accumulates around that network. Step 6, make a video about justice. YouTube my video. Put it on Vimeo. See if it spreads virally. See if there's any media convergence accumulating around my ideas and problems. Step 7, join an online activist group to raise some money for justice, maybe to publicize some injustice. Create a gadget or an application or a product that has some relevance to the justice. And step 8, create an injustice map on Google Maps. So, what's happening? Well, here's Arthur Croker, kind of my guru in postmodernism. Big fan of Arthur's. He just wrote this week. The common thread, he says, in the periodic convulsive meltdown of contemporary capitalism is a radical transformation in the nature of capitalism itself. From material value to a future of immaterial value. From a history of financialization to the specter of automated trading systems seemingly beyond human control. From production to the illusion of accumulation without production. Okay, and there's a lot of Marxism in that paragraph, but basically everything in it has some kind of literary resonance. If you take the word capitalism out and you put in the word history or the word literature, you get exactly the same effect. The common thread in the periodic convulsive meltdown of contemporary history is a radical transformation in the nature of history itself, from material value to a future of immaterial value, from a history to the specter of automated history systems seemingly beyond human control, from production of history to the illusion of history without consequence. Right? And then he goes on. Circulating like a virus, the wild ride of digital capitalism brings whole continents to their financial knees. The housing bubble in the USA, the crisis of euro debt now, and incipient changes in China's economy next. No country is exempt, no individual untouched, no society unaffected, no empire immune. History is on the move once again. So he's finally coming up and playing the history trump card. I don't think that's history he's describing. I mean, history is on the move once again. I mean, what he's trying to say is like capitalism's narrative is collapsing, and his idea of history, which is, leftist dialectic historical materialism or whatever Arthur's into this season, I mean, he sees the collapse of capitalism as a sign that non-capitalist systems are going to get back on horseback. I don't think that's what these two paragraphs actually say. Because what he's describing there, the wild ride, the virus, the being brought to the knees, the bubbleness, the crisis, the incipient changes, that's not history, that's chaos. That's chaos. So, are we really in a different period now? In a period that I like to describe as favela chic and gothic high tech. I mean, I don't want to go into that because it's kind of novelistic. I'm not really suited for media philosophers. If you're keenly interested in that, you can go look up some speeches of mine. Or heck, just Google favela chic and gothic high tech and see what happens. But, is something happening? Well, I think it is. And I think it's deeper than people let on. And I think it's kind of time for it to happen. I mean, if you consider modernity to be something that lasted from the 1920s to the early 1970s, and postmodernity to be something from 1970s to maybe just over the post-millennium, well, that's 40 years. I mean, that means that postmodernity lasted almost as long as modernity. We're about the same length of time. And, 40 years is kind of a long time to walk around being post something, right? So, I don't doubt for a moment that postmodernity existed and was culturally distinct from modernity, but I don't think this thing we've got going on is postmodernity. I don't think it's really got much to do with it, and I don't think it has any more to do with postmodernity than postmodernity did with modernity, which in the early days was kind of a lot, but, as time passed, it became very different. So, I think network culture is here. And I think its philosophy of history is atemporality. I can use anything that I have on the screen, no matter where it came from, who brought it up, when it was made, or where it was made, or what their identity was, or what their identity politics was. And I'm much more interested in cross-linking and Google juice than I am in a coherent narrative. I'm much more into webs and clouds than roads and highways. I'm really not going anywhere in particular. I don't have a desire to go anywhere in particular. Now, atemporality means that time is supreme over history. Basically, I think that's what it means. It means that you're skeptical about any narrative of time because you know that they all wear out. They're fads. Some last longer than others, but none of them are absolute reality. Time has tremendous power over our ideas about time. Our ideas about time are extremely frail compared to time. Our ideas about time are highly temporary concepts. Atemporality is a contingent philosophy of history. It's a philosophy of history with an expiration date baked in. We're not trying to be aggressively modern or conservative. We're just contemporary. That sort of Gibsonian grab bag now, as he put it. Let me just see if I can quote his crystalline prose here. Yeah. Every future is someone else's past, every present someone else's future. Stuff, the mixed bag of the quotidian. You're pro-quotidian. Contemporary, transition to nowhere, maybe transition to mayhem. 9/11, the war in Iraq, the real estate crash, the financial crash, an unaddressed climate crisis, and an oil disaster. These really look like the signs of people who were deliberately closing their eyes to objective historical forces. We can't be blindsided so many times by so many large events without having somehow lost a thread. So, this brings up the issue of how to tell what happens next, or at least how to make good best guesses about it. And I think futurism is a subset of history. I mean, to explain the future is basically the same rhetorical problem, the same analytical problem as how to explain what happened in the past. I mean, how do you know what happened in the past? I mean, prediction and retrodiction have similar issues. You weren't there. You're not going to be there. And how can we avoid being too bound up in the now? How can we avoid taking the present moment for granted? How can we learn to recognize the present as the living melange of the past and the future and feel okay about that? How can we accept that we never get a fresh slate, no matter how hard we try? How can we understand that our ideas about the future are mostly mashups about old ideas about the future? Ideas about the future are very traditional. They're really made out of mulch. And how can we calmly accept that as the way of the world and maybe even get a better grip on what's actually happening? I don't know. I mean, all I've got is rules of thumb, and I think that what I really need for an analysis like this is probably some media philosophy. I think maybe media philosophy might really be of practical and immediate use in a crisis of this kind. I mean, I know certain things, I know that the newer something may seem, the more important it is to think of its death. I mean, not of it just getting old and becoming old-fashioned, but actually think of its death. I know that it's important to refuse the awe of the future and to refuse reverence to the past. Just block those feelings out. And along with these refusals, these dual refusals, because they're really the same thing, you need some more positive sense of a humane solidarity and a hospitality to human beings who happen not to be living in your historical period. You really need a certain intellectual cordiality to them that we don't often manifest. I mean, if you're discussing Plato, I mean, imagine Plato discussing you. I mean, try to escape the implicit sense of stuffy superiority over someone who merely happens to have been dead a couple of millennia. I mean, imagine asking Plato for advice. You know, imagine that he sort of comes into the olive grove and says, okay, what seems to be your trouble? Now, you know, imagine him explaining things to you rather than vice versa. So, you know, I know a lot about how to escape the box because, you know, I hang out with futurists and very future-minded people. It struck me that I don't know very much about building a box, especially when the old box is made out of wet, decaying paper. It's a paper cardboard box. And I know how to do things at Futurism. I know about classic strategic forecasting, trend spotting, technical forecasting, demographics, youth, education. I know about history. I know about how new products and services behave within the matrix of society, the question mark, the rising star, the cash cow, the dead dog. I know about S-curves. I know that no tree rises to the sky. I know about hype cycles, troughs of disillusionment, plateaus of usability. I know about disruptive innovation. I know how that works. We are getting surprised a lot despite a horde of futurists. We're getting really awful surprises. 9/11, the real estate crash, the finance crash at the sovereign wealth funds, the oil disaster, blah, blah, blah. I see the evidence of atemporality in popular culture all around me, just Frankenstein mashups of past and future by people who clearly have lost the ability to tell the difference or don't care. They're steampunks, atom punks, they're diesel punks. People are doing stuff with dead regimes, with colonialism. You want a really good example of this? Completely harmless looking French kids cartoon. Saw it yesterday. Sally Bollywood. Sally Bollywood is a French girl detective who appears on the web, and she's drawn in Japanese anime style. Ever seen Sally Bollywood? You know, I'm not saying Sally Bollywood is good. I'm just saying Sally Bollywood is like a kind of perfect period atemporal artifact. Where's her identity politics? Okay, maybe she's got a little bit of gender politics because she's like an unmarried girl with a bindi on her forehead who like beats people up with kung fu while wearing a sari. But she's French, you know, and she speaks French and she's drawn like a Japanese girl. All right, somebody like came up with that. Was that like a tremendous leap? I don't think so. I mean, that's contemporary French kid culture. That's not like, you know, somebody bending over backward to, you know, warp the signifiers. It's just a group of people trying to make some money doing a kid cartoon. I mean, I see globalization everywhere, transcultural effects very similar to transtemporal effects. You know, if you want to get an atemporal thing, you just see how many supposedly old-fashioned things are in very good health in somebody else's culture, or even advanced, like trains in Europe as opposed to trains in the U.S. I mean, trains in the U.S. are a wagon train, you know, they're the golden spike. I mean, they're relics of continental whatever, whereas, you know, in Europe, trains are the TGV. They're kind of the new low-carbon network and so forth and so on. There's new things that are coming out of network culture that have never appeared in society before or appeared only in agonizing slow motion. Open source material just there for use, online collaboration, online world building. There are just too many people to control in network society. There aren't many mechanisms to control them. They're not hierarchical. I mean, they're not free of status or in some utopia, but they're just in a different operating field. And it's not just hackers on the web or, you know, unruly cyberpunks of some kind who are operating within this framework. The wealthy do that. I mean, the story of the real estate crash and the finance crash and the sovereign wealth crash is mob rule by wealthy panicked people. They're an online mob with nobody to straighten them out. It really is rumor-driven mob panic for the wealthy. That's what we've got. And we don't have any way to mellow them out because they really are panicked. I mean, they're just setting fire to everything they can reach. And there's no off switch or any sort of central sanity control station. So I don't want this to sound like a counsel of despair or anything. And in some ways, it's an extremely interesting historical period. And the fact that it's like so free of sense, and that and that our narrative of what we're doing to ourselves is so entirely detached from what's really going on, it really kind of offers us sort of new possibilities in history. I mean, in history, historians are always they're always blamed for being puppets of their parochial outlook in space and time. I really think we're in a situation where our parochial outlook in space and time makes almost no coherent sense. It's just very hard for us to be parochial. We're just sort of intellectually all over the map. I mean, we're just kind of thin, scattered, hyperlinked, and spewed around. So, I don't expect this particular period to last forever. I mean, atemporality, whatever it is, I think it's going to have a briefer lifespan than modernism or postmodernism. My suspicion is we're in for something that's going to last about 10 years, and it may already be a year old, so that would make it 9. I think it's going to bust. I mean, something is going to happen that is so large and so unexpected and so irrevocable that it's just going to change the tenor of society so widely over such a long period that it's just going to be impossible to say that we're living in the way that we live. I don't think it's a singularity or anything sci-fi like that, but it's going to be something we don't expect, and it's going to be something that just changes everything. Now, it might change it for the worse, or it might change it for the better, or like most historical changes, it could be for the worse and the better, and it doesn't really matter. But who can really do something about this? I mean, who can really kind of get at the nest of problems here and sort of reorient the disoriented? I don't mean come up with a new story. I mean just find a value system that makes some sense, or just offer a kind of platform or foundation for effective innovation. I mean, who's going to do that? Is it going to be the military? I don't think so. Is it going to be a political party? Possibly. Is it going to be a social network, like maybe some new online-based thing? I would rank that pretty high. I think there's a pretty good chance something might actually emerge online that sort of says, okay, we're here and we're really good at whatever. Is it going to be novelists like myself? I don't think so, because we're too tied to paper and we're too tied to the old distribution systems and the old methods of publishing and the just the gothic high-tech rotting structure of analog media. Will it be visual artists? I don't see how. Musicians are in worse trouble than we are. Campaigning journalists, I don't see many of them keeping their jobs. I mean, maybe they could become activists of some kind, but how do they get the word out when the word isn't really piped through a central medium anymore? Who the heck is really going to do it? I mean, who can do something about it? I mean, who actually has sort of means, motive, and opportunity to do something useful? And I hate to say it, and I don't hate to say it. I kind of exult in saying that maybe it's media philosophers. I mean, maybe it really is media philosophers. I mean, maybe what we need is some people who are super hip on media and also have some kind of really timeless, well thought through, moral, ethical, ontological, hermeneutical structure. People who are just really great at it. People, who offer a kind of rock-like foundational basis for a society that's mostly, the buzzing gnats of a cloud of data flies. Maybe them, who knows? The world needs help. The world needs help, ladies and gentlemen. So thank you for your attention. Maybe some questions here. Somebody was asking about all the stickers on my laptop earlier. Maybe I should explain that since you had to stare at them. If you hang out at Web 2.0 gigs a lot, as I do, it's very common to see people with sort of tattooed laptops of this kind, and it's just kind of a cultural signifier that sort of says, I'm into social media. But why do I have this? Well, no particular reason. This is the Reboot conference. I went to that one. Very nice web conference up in Copenhagen. This is the Lyft conference. I'm a member of the board of Lyft. They're doing a lot of very interesting stuff in France, Switzerland, Korea. This is a wine label from Piemonte. I hang out in Piemonte. They're big foodies. This is Piemonte Share Festival. It's an electronic arts festival. I'm a judge for their contest. I'm on their board. This is Layer, which is a Dutch augmented reality company. I'm quite close to them, doing a lot of work in augmented reality. May do a book about augmented reality. What do I like about augmented reality? I could go on about that quite a while. I'll probably have to take several thousand pages. If you want to see some augmented reality, you can go on my blog right now. I've got a hell of a lot of augmented reality on my blog, Beyond the Beyond. Somewhere around here I've got my augmented reality t-shirt. It's not running, but it actually augments reality. It's a t-shirt that augments reality. It does, sorry, it just plain does. And then this little item across the top is a whole row of dead media. And I used to own all of these objects. I had a pencil, I had a rubber stamp, I had a lot of paper clamps, I had a wire-framed in-basket, I had manila folders, I had a desktop telephone with a wire that came out of it, and I had a manual typewriter. And I was earning a living, right? I use these things every day. I was in deadly earnest about it, and it's just a long row of ghosts. They couldn't be any deader. The guys who repair typewriters are almost all dead now. So, I keep them there as I don't know, what are they? Scalps, memento mori, whatever. I feel better when I see them. I don't know why. Maybe because they're all in one device. This device performs every one of those functions except printing. Oh. Yeah, that's that. So, a question, since I answered one without being asked then. Yes?
In the last couple of days, some of the issues underlying what we're talking about came up. And one of the things that was said today is that philosophy job temporarily is to do what you're doing, which is to point out the issues and to talk them through, not necessarily just prescribe the future. And if there's a pitfall in your aspiration, I think it's that. I think that if anything is the automatic, it's utopianism. And what we ought to do is just pay attention to what's going on right now and try and deal with structural issues that are here. And what's the big shift that'll happen? I don't know. But I do think that you're a lot closer than you may give yourself credit, and that if some of the running commentary you gave is captured on gravity, because in it is, I think, the beginning of a new way of talking about things. And the big issue today is that there isn't any really common language for people to talk about this stuff. And there aren't that many people that are in your position. I know, everybody that's in wants to believe that this is like ubiquitous, and it's not. And yeah, there's penetration of this stuff, but not in terms of the depth of the learning. And it's those people that they stand at the next to Vincent, not at technology. And if you want to think about what's going on with technology, I'd be willing to bet you, I'm pretty cynical, but you know what's going on in Silicon Valley today?
Well, I was there last week.
Okay. Mostly, the big money is still being made the same way it was in 1965. Right? Silicon, networks, telecommunications. The only thing that's new, the biotech stuff, it's basically just new medicine. Right? But and what they're trying to do is take the existing platforms and squeeze more out of them. So until they reach the theoretical limit, no one has to deal with the structural issues. Because right now, an interesting thing was said by Kipler, 10 days ago? The CPU is so ubiquitous now, right, that even though you know, maybe 50 years out, they might figure out how to make photonic quantum computing happen. Between now and then, who knows when that future is, by the way, I don't know. But between now and then, they got to squeeze it out of what we got. Which is why I say, focus on what's now. The future's here. It's it. This is it. You know, it's like we pass through it every minute of every day. And if we'd stop like trying to project the future and trying to fix the way people are supposed to be and just deal with the shit that's on the table, you know, we might actually have a chance.
Well, you know, I take your point there, but I don't think that's working. And I think the difficulty comes between, you know, the idea of projecting the future, or sort of putting the future on some kind of iron ideological rails, and dealing with the structural issue. Because you can't really do the one without the other. I mean, if you're dealing with the structural issues, you're just tinkering with the infrastructure while dodging the politics.
In which case you're going to need a narrative.
Well, you know, I'm all for that, but you know, if you just continually add infrastructure without concern for other, you know, without concern for some sort of willed change, I mean, what you get is basically feral technological development, and I think that's at the root of things like the finance crisis. You know, I mean, you just sort of like add more silicon to the banks. Or it's at the root of the oil crash, the oil spill. It's like, okay, well, we'll just drill deeper and it sort of seems to be safe. And there's really nobody to kind of come in and say, well, you know, don't sort of redouble the whatever. No, you know, I'm not a Luddite, and I don't believe that, like, there's some particular set of mandarins who can, like, come in and look after all this stuff. But I really worry about the kind of haphazard catch-as-catch-can approach that sort of is too hands-off about it. You know, I mean, we can't, I mean, the shit that we've got on the ground, as you put it, can kill us really easily. You know, I mean, every one of these little gizmo, you know, Silicon Valley guys, and I was just in Silicon Valley, where, you know, the exact issue that you brought up was like right on the ground. I mean, it was actually the key to this augmented reality conference that I went to. It was the most boring panel, but it was also the most important panel. And there was 3 chip fab guys from, you know, Qualcomm and NVIDIA and some other obscure but extremely profitable company trying to form a tacit alliance with augmented reality people to get bigger chips into handheld devices, right? And why are they going to do that? For the exact reason you say, because they've been selling silicon since 1965, and they want to sell more silicon real estate. So how do you trick phone companies into putting more silicon into handheld devices? Well, you know, you have to come up with a Hail Mary maneuver. Well, you have form a tacit alliance with guys who are doing applications that demand more processing power, right? It's the Wintel duopoly all over again. Okay, you know, I understand why they do that. I don't decry it. I don't say that it's evil or anything. But every one of these devices burns up as much power as a refrigerator. Not in the device itself, but in the server that's like feeding this, you know, this thing of, okay, who's in charge of looking after that? That's not a hard thing to project. It doesn't take genius to figure that out. You know, I mean, if we were like throwing maidens into the top of a volcano in order to like power our handheld devices, presumably some kind of qualm would kick in. We wouldn't just say, oh, well, let's double the amount of maidens every 18 months. You know, I mean, where are the tripwires there? You can't just go on forfeiting responsibility for things that have obvious short-term, clear and present danger problems. And we've like methodically stripped the ability to do anything about it through any method. I mean, not just government, but through finance or through the military or through the church or through social groups of any kind. We've just sort of methodically stripped all the control mechanisms out. We can look at anything. We can, you know, look anything up. We have tremendous access to information, but man, we're just like, I don't know. I mean, it's like it's like our hands are soldered to the keyboard. I mean, we're networking while Rome burns. In the back there.
Right? Back about 2005, I think it was another friend of mine. Anyway, we were talking about this very same problem.
Right.
And his approach was just to call it like N time. Just
right.
Like an N or X time.
Yes.
My term for it, and because I actually developed it a bit more, was to call it the, and it isn't here yet. I think you're right, we're in this kind of transition period, but the eventual result is what I call a permanent contemporary.
Yeah.
Where basically you're always in the contemporary. We can dispense with notions of modernity, postmodernity, all this kind of crap,
yes.
and just simply say, oh, that was the art of 2026.
Uh-huh.
Or this was the music of 2085.
Yeah.
Or this was the history of fashion in 2366.
Yes, yes.
However you want to slice that up.
Yeah.
But the thing that you're always in the contemporary. It's always
there you go.
It's a permanent condition that will basically last indefinitely. So that was one thing. I just want to throw that out to you. I'm sure it's in the Empire Archive somewhere.
I really ought to, I don't know, take some time and make a list of all of these, because, I think this sort of, pollen of the postmodern is showing up all over the landscape. Everybody's sneezing. I mean, everybody knows it's true. I mean, especially people in technology know that network society is obsolescing digital society really fast, and it's actually killing it off faster than it's killing off the wreckage of the analog. Yeah. It's like those who live close to the volcano are most clearly scorched by the fire. So, I don't want to privilege my own verb about this. I mean, I'm a sci-fi writer. I make up a lot of weird nouns and adjectives. It's like, I don't know, it's like breeding pet Pomeranians and letting them loose to bark. I don't really care. What I sort of care about is more like what we do, I mean.
Well, which leads me to my next point that I wanted to talk with you about, because I had 2 points. The second one is questions of resources, really. And I'm getting, it's part of my PhD that I'm working on. And the resource situation is looking really pretty grim.
Yes.
And parallel to that is the second law of thermo, which is hard to get around. We can get efficient and more efficient with our use of resources.
Right.
But eventually you get to a point of granularity where it's just up or down, on or off.
Yep.
So that's another issue. So when we talk about issues of the future, futurity, very rarely is there, it seems to me in much writing, real concrete discussions of who gets what when. And I'm just wondering if you could talk about that a bit.
Well, I'm concerned that we get that hand splatting thing that you just did. I'm not sure it has the second law of thermodynamics, but I think we really could just get slapped upside the head by something very powerful we're paying no focused attention to. And at that point, the effect is going to be so profound on people that we will be in a new historical period, only instead of being one that we sort of wanted to be in, it's just one we're going to be battered into, like I don't know, like one of those four food groups, the 4 food groups of irrational faith, Christian fundamentalism, the New Age, whatever, psychic transhumanism, posthumanism, and secular ecology. I mean, that's just not going to save our bacon, and then somebody's going to turn to them in some condition where, the fuse breaker ought to be there, or, somebody ought to be repairing the exploding well or whatever. And, people are just suddenly going to throw their hands up in the air and, hey, man, the lamps are going out all over Europe or whatever. And they need not actually go out. We might be surprised on the upside by some kind of white swan we don't understand, like, why? Who would have guessed that a 14-year-old child made an old fusion in a rubber balloon in Xinjiang, China? And it's like, and it's all over. And it's like, I saw it on video. And everybody sees it, and it just kind of spreads virally, and it's immediately huge. I mean, because there's a lot of that stuff around. I mean, there are more cell phones than toilets. I mean, there are more people who have cell phones than can read. So that's not like a minor kind of penetration. I mean, that's really it's a different human condition, and just,
No,
I don't know.
I wouldn't say that the kind of smash point is like necessarily a violent disruption. I think that people, as you're describing, just tend to muddle through. And so it's just a question of what is going to be the condition of muddling through is kind of like the interesting.
Well, you know, the normal human condition of muddling through is a dark ages. When you sort of look at the statistics of how we normally muddle through, we know fuck all about anything. There's no education, there's no literacy. You've got like a pasture and, you know, a little light agriculture and maybe some hunting gathering, and that's generally how we do it. And we're like do it for centuries at a time, and nobody seems to care. You know, and that's kind of our default condition when we're not like busy building roads and aqueducts and semaphores or this other kind of frail, top-heavy stuff that we're so keen on doing. So, you know, I'm not real keen on the muddle through scenario there, because I mean, if we were, and we've been muddling. I mean, we muddled ever since like Bush took power in the United States. You know, I mean, if you needed like a genial non-entity to make a series of non-decisions, I mean, except for war, of course. Oh, I mean, what does muddling have to boast about, really? And you know, and also muddling is just, there's something freaky about it. Like, you know, I'm very fond of Eastern European situations, so you know, I'm like kind of a big fan of the transition. But people have been in transition now since 1989. You know, and that's as far away as like World War II from 1964. I mean, how much transition do you want? I mean, pretty soon you're going to be in transition longer than you were a communist. I mean, like, transition to what? It's like, okay, well, you know, we're in the permanent transition. We're sort of in the permanent contemporary, you know. It's like, okay, well, what does that imply? I mean, that my granddad was right about everything, that I don't really have to learn anything new, that, you know, the 2017 really is basically no different from 2015, that there's nothing in particular to look forward to. I mean, is that something that we're really going to be happy with? I mean, it basically sounds like the digital neo-medieval. I don't know. I mean, under a circumstance like that, you would imagine people to be forming caste systems. Really. You know, and sort of like little trade fairs or something. Because, you know, it's all the same and it's all going to stay the same, so why don't I just, like, put my roots down and sort of get what I can, and, you know, I mean, there's no disruption and no, you throw a chip overboard and the sails are slack and nothing moves. I mean, is that the kind of society that we want to tell people is a great idea? I mean, I don't think that's exactly what, I mean, I clearly I'm distorting what you said on the Empire list. I'm not claiming that you think that that's a great idea. I'm just saying that it's sort of a, you know, it's a difficulty in the kind of throw up your hand philosophy that sort of says, well, you know, we shouldn't have muddled because we don't understand. In point of fact, we understand perfectly well. We've just systematically removed all the mechanisms by which we could interfere with market power.
I agree with you, because I feel that's kind of what my fear is. Muddling through process, that style of dealing with that. I disagree with you.
Well, you know, I mean, the Washington Consensus worked perfectly well for at least a little while. It's just sort of like, let's privatize everything and sort of let the market settle things. And, well, the market won't settle things. Well, the Pentagon will come blow those guys up for you. You know, okay. You know, I mean, you know, it's all right. I mean, it was a way of life, you know, and like people started bootstrapping and, you know, suddenly India and China and Brazil became dynamic powers in that period. And it's like, wait a minute, you know, yeah, we could actually, like, get somewhere with this. I was like, what, you mean you'll trade with us? And it's like, okay, you know. I mean, I don't have any problem with Brazil, Russia, and India, China, you know, grabbing some kind. But I do kind of have a problem with Brazil, Russia, India, and China clearly having a more coherent grip on their public life than other states. I mean, you know, because these are not muddle-along kind of countries. You can't call China a fucking muddle-along country. They got forests of skyscrapers. You know, for India to be more dynamic than France, what is that about? You know, and for Brazil to be like diplomatic leaders of the planet and sort of manufacturing global initiatives by the dozen, I mean, I respect the Brazilians very much. You know, I'm glad to see them batting above their weight or batting at their weight or whatever, but how come everybody else is so numbed to that? Shouldn't they at least be paying more coherent attention to the Brazilians? You know, I mean, shouldn't the Brazilians be leaders, really? I mean, shouldn't people sort of be hanging on Lula's every word or whatever? It's like he's the most popular Brazilian president ever. Got like 90% approval ratings in his home state. You know, clearly the guy's some kind of political genius. How come the Lula solution isn't trumpeted all over the world? I mean, why isn't he like fated like Václav Havel? It's because he's a socialist. You know, it's because he actually intervenes in public life in his country. He like does stuff. That's why. It's unthinkable for a national leader to do stuff. You know, it interferes with market valuations. But once they blow a fuse, you know, where do they go? I mean, people believe in free market ideology, obviously, but it doesn't make any more sense than the fundamentalist Christianity and the secular eco, whatever, and the post-human, super Ayn Randian, Nietzschean bullshit stuff. I don't know, is that good?
You know, I have a question I want to run past you, which is more about practice and crafts in the writing.
Right.
A lot of your work was about the future before, and it seems like there's been this kind of involution curve going, where you're writing more about the present or the near future than about things that would have, you know, taken place hundreds of years ago in your writing 30 years ago. Or
right.
Years ago. Why, I mean, one could argue science fiction is a reflection of imperial narrative. I mean, if you're thinking about
Sure, absolutely.
talking about. But more currently, you're looking at this multipolar dynamic that's
Yeah.
Do you feel like you're just more obsessed with the near future than the further curve or something? I mean,
no, I think Gibson is like that. I mean, Gibson is, you know, he's been very keen on that, and you know, and I follow what he's doing. I mean, he wrote books that were set in a sort of remote future, the 2030s, and then he wrote books that were suddenly set 10 years in the future, and then he wrote a book which was set in the date that the book was published, and then finally he had the nerve to, you know, write a book which is extremely futuristic, but actually set in a year in the past. And he realizes that this is like one of his most successful works of science fiction, which is actually set in the near past. And, you know, he's a little surprised and upset by that. I don't particularly find that upsetting. I mean, I'm glad that he did it, but I don't think it's like paradigm shattering. Because I think a lot of the most interesting works of science fiction are set in the past. I mean, you know, like Wells and Verne and Stapleton are really interesting living presences in the genre. And they're writing about stuff that happened in the 19th century. So, you know, it doesn't cause the top of my head to explode when I read, you know, fantastic works set in an imaginary past. That's not like a paradigm breaker. So, you know, I was aware of that trend because I like to write stuff set in contemporary times too. So my most recent novel is set in the 2060s, and it's extremely futuristic. But I'm not sure it's a success. I don't really think it fits the tenor of our times.
But the caryatids?
Yeah.
Is that correct pronunciation?
Yeah, caryatids, sure. Yeah, it's set in the 2060s and has a lot of, you know, great deal of radical mid-21st century high technology in it. It's kind of super chrome-plated and it's got lots of, you know, awesome techno signifiers in it. And, you know, people who like that like it, but I really think it's kind of a, I don't know, it's kind of a living platypus in the current literary landscape. So, you know, and I did it really to kind of test the waters. I mean, I felt what you were saying, and I thought, well, I can buck this trend, and I did buck the trend. But, you know, bucking the trend doesn't necessarily work that well. I mean, it's not necessarily a service to your readers to sort of prove that you can do something which is counter or mulish. So, you know, there are other things going on in writing that I think are more, that are sort of closer to the bone. You know, and one of them is a story that I just wrote. It's up online. It's a cooperative story with my friend Chris Nakashima Brown called Windsor Executive Solutions. And it's an online published story which attempts to use an electronic vernacular. I mean, every piece of dialogue in that story, and there are lots of them, is electronically mediated. It's all people sending SMS messages or sending email or talking to one another over headsets. There's not a single face-to-face encounter between any of the characters, right? So, I mean, traditionally, literature tends to follow the vernacular. I mean, a literary language is quite refined and kind of top-end, and vernacular language is much more immediate and kind of dialectic-based. And we're in a situation where people do not communicate on paper, and in fact, they commonly don't even communicate verbally. They really are talking into little gizmos, you know, or sending asynchronous messages. And this is the way people talk to, like, their lovers and their children and their bosses and their old army buddies and, you know, whatever. I mean, they'll send they'll write touching tributes on the webpage of a guy who died in Facebook. I mean, they'll write on the Facebook wall of a dead guy. It's like, Fred, you really meant a lot to me. And, you know, I mean, okay, this is like, okay, you know, in theory, this ought to reflect, I mean, it sort of has to reflect in literary practice, because if it diverges too far from the vernacular, you get a very dry Mandarin kind of literary Latin thing going on, which is fatal, at least to popular fiction. But there isn't really a good way to do that on paper.
Do you think that's resonant with something like Charles Strauss's or Cory Doctorow? They're both dealing with a lot of web narrative as well. They're kind of,
you know, I see colleagues of mine like Strauss and Doctorow really struggling with this stuff. I don't think they're fully aware of it. I think they really like to write novels. And I think that they feel that, like, novels are somehow an inherent part of the communication universe. And it's not true. I mean, novels are industrial artifacts. They didn't exist until mass production, sort of lending libraries and a mass literate public existed. You know, and they're all about the means of production and the demographics and all the rest of it. There's nothing sacred about a novel, right? And there were long, long periods of time when nobody wrote them or read them. They just weren't even imaginable. There are other means of communication, like verse, epic verse, short stories of one kind or another, et cetera, et cetera. People just didn't do novels. Yeah?
How do you see a media philosopher who is trained, operating, and paid based on textual, critical analysis having a central impact on the digital world? How do you see that crossing over? Like, and I want to compare it to like an open source engineer. Pick one, like
Well, you know, that's exactly what our class is doing. And that's what we spent the whole day trying to do. Imagine some guy in the future, and he's a media philosopher, and he probably doesn't sell books, and he's probably not a television talking head, and he probably doesn't have a lot of academic support either. Okay, what are this guy's means, motives, and opportunity, and how does he get by in the world? It's anybody's fucking guess, brother. I mean, you know, it's like asking a pop musician the same question. I mean, I would say that, you know, philosophers have managed to scrape by for quite a long period. They're sort of more ductile about doing it than, say, leather makers, you know. But I really don't have a clue. I mean, I don't know what the heck they do. I mean, presumably they would infest the web in some way, but I don't think they get a direct, they're not going to get directly paid for content on the web. I mean, that's just sort of ludicrous. I don't know. I mean, perhaps they start a cult. I don't know. I mean, or what would pass for a cult? I mean, maybe they're just surrounded by zealots. Maybe they're politicians. Maybe they're gangsters of some kind. You know, maybe they're social networking mavens. I mean, maybe they're gurus, teachers. You know, maybe they're entertainers, stand-up philosophers. You know. I mean, what are they? When philosophers have an impact on society, they're usually allied to some kind of backup group that's got the girls, gold, guns, and money. I mean, you know, they're in the Charter 89 movement, or, you know, they're, you know, allied with Wagnerian something or other. If they're Nietzsche, you know, just you know, how did Spinoza get by grinding little glass lenses? You know, how did I wish I had a way to figure that out. I don't have one, and I really have cold comfort to offer, because I think that a lot of the institutions we have that provide cultural continuity are being dismantled very rapidly. They're sort of Gothic high-tech or favela chic.
You know, speaking of the favela chic, I was just in Sudan 2 weeks ago, in Khartoum, and they've been under complete U.S. sanctions for a while, and I bought a book of yours, Mirror Shades.
Oh, good.
To give to...
That's all I need, a lot of cyberpunk in Sudan. Kind of rocking it there.
There were these ex-child soldiers that have done some projects, so I was trying to figure out some fun ways to get them to think about creativity. And
was that book in a regional language, or are these like child soldiers reading English? That's it. Okay, great.
But, they started Xeroxing, and then some of them were like sending text messages. I'll forward you some links about it, but they were trying to make. There's this one guy, Emmanuel Jal, who has a film called War Child. He was Dave Eggers, this book, The What is the What?
Yeah, I saw that book.
Yeah, it's sort of about him a little bit, but those guys were trying to figure out, is this now? Or they were just, it was very funny trying to get them to, as we have been hearing these kinds of questions, but imagine being in hot Khartoum, 51 degrees Celsius, and seeing trying to make sense of it. I'm intrigued to see how people are dancing around the idea of the modern storyteller right now, because I think it's either, like you're saying, the novel's an artifact of the industrial era, or are we moving into sort of a post-Gutenberg galaxy with McLuhan's ideas of the return of orality, or back to Africa? That's what he used to say, is this idea of the African pan-linguistic play of memory and stuff like that. But there is the modern story is just like kind of a slow motion collapse. It's difficult to really find innovation in the medium.
Right.
I mean, I have to admit, Bruce is one of the probably...
I certainly don't innovate in storytelling. I mean, I innovate in stuff that stories are about, but I really don't. I mean, I do a lot of writing that isn't stories at all, but it's published in story magazines, and I think there's very cold comfort to be found in that, because really orality is the ultimate kind of storytelling, and absolutely fucking nobody does that. I mean, even your grandmother won't tell you a story now. And the idea of like going to your best friend and saying, "Tell me a story." If stories were what it was about, you ought to be able to just ask your lover, So, tell me your story. And he ought to be able to say something enrapturing to you that sort of starts at the beginning and kind of works its way up. I mean, the one thing you could do with sort of tell me a story is resolve. It's kind of good for resolving interview problems as a journalist, right? Because if you go up and ask somebody to say what happens, he'll usually sort of be kind of stuck. But if you go up as somebody who's sort of visibly distressed, and you say, instead of saying, okay, who did what to whom when, if you just sort of say, so what seems to be the story here, commonly you'll get some kind of gush out of this person, which is sort of, it has the thematic relations of a story, and commonly it has some kind of vague protagonist. Sort of I always told Linda that someday something awful would happen. And it's like, so who was Linda? Well, she's the girl who's dead in this 18-car pileup. Oh, okay. So what seemed to be, the difficulty? Well, Linda liked to do this and do that, and then there was the time when she did this. But then it got really bad because Fred came, and and he is the guy with all the cocaine. All right, at that point, everything sort of begins to fall into place, and you kind of got a story, but that's not a story. Like if I start writing that down for the Atlantic Monthly, it's like Linda and the 18-car pileup. Linda was a bright young girl with fast reflexes, but poor impulse control, and it's not, it's just not, it's not any there, right? I mean, our problems with atemporality, to refer back to them, are quite nebulous, and everybody wants to pass the buck to somebody else. And the difficulty with that is that really you're laying yourself up. Arrive with the story is going to be some kind of asshole on horseback. My star of destiny. Jews and everything will be great. It's like, wow, what a simple and immediate story. I was sitting here all confused about my unemployment, and then there was like this sound of shattering glass and like all these guys in uniform. And it's like, wow, you know, what a compelling narrative. And it's like, and you go, oh, what are they doing? Look, there's a cathedral of light here, you know, like exciting songs and guys marching with shovels. And it's like, wow, I felt so confused and helpless, and I was just muddling along. And now it's like, everything is like 1,000 years, right, you know. And all the movies are like that now, and it's like fantastic, and you know, whatever. Okay, well, you know, that's an occupational hazard of you know, of forfeiting any sort of democratic control over the fate of people.
Well, I mean, do you think William S. Burroughs was kind of more resonant with that? You know, the whole like kind of fracture. I mean, he seems to be, to me, resonant with some of the stuff you're talking about.
Well, you know, he lived for a long time, but gee whiz, the body count around Bill Burroughs was unbelievably high. And hanging out with that guy was one of the best ways in the world to die young. It's unbelievable. It's getting late, eh? It's past 10. Gosh, that is kind of late. You're a very patient crowd. Maybe one more question here. Yeah?
Today in class and then also through the lecture, you were using a lot of terminology from management culture, management society. I wouldn't call it culture.
Right.
But it's Schumpeter, creative destruction. And,
sure.
And coming out of that context, like the last couple of years in real time, going through this collapse, the Depression 2.0.
Right.
You know, in some ways, I think where you got just before Paul's question is really an intended result. You know, having dealt with Drucker specifically, he identified himself late in life as a conservative Christian anarchist.
Yeah.
And George Bush gave him a medal in 2002, you know, for whatever it was he actually did. In my contention is it was create a management society. And all those collapses that you're talking about are basically man-made catastrophes. Whether it's the CDOs going ballistic, that was a predictable problem, and it was predicted, and people tried to stop it, and people insisted that it not be stopped, and it had intended results.
Right.
And so I think, like, from my perspective, and the same thing with BP and deregulating, you know, that kind of drilling and letting them do this was going to happen. In fact, it had happened. It's happened a couple of times, just not this bad.
Right.
So, like, in some ways, I really feel that passion and disconnect with how that shouldn't happen. That these things are not happening accidentally. And just to mention about, like Paul, because this is such a common thread throughout all this stuff, this discussion of creativity. Sir Ken Robinson, Mahadi, Shikmith, I can't say his name, I've met him.
Chris Chickman-Sahi?
Huh?
Chris Chickman-Sahi?
No, he wrote Flow.
Oh, Chickmeth.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I can't. I met him.
My son teaches at MIT.
Well, the guy that wrote Flow,
Chickmeth.
Yeah, Chick
Yes.
I'm not sure I'm pronouncing it. His name was
Chickmeth.
Yeah.
Yeah, and on a Scrabble triple word score, man. You're through the roof. Yeah, I'm familiar with the guy's work.
You know, and the way that that's flowing into the educational system or the entertainment system basically is a top-down hierarchy enforcing real changes in privatization of entire industries and sectors of the society, like education. That's Davos last year. The World Economic Forum was designing the future. And
I'm very keen on Davos.
Right.
A lot of interesting stuff goes on there. It's a great place to trend spot.
In Salzburg those things are their plans.
I guess, but you know, it's not like a thing called business management, and that this thing is somehow immune from time, so that it somehow doesn't make any difference if you're Peter Drucker, who's writing about General Motors in the 1950s, or some more recent business guy writing, you know, some business bestseller management book. I mean, I'm very keen on business management because I think it's got an interesting argot, but it very much fluctuates with time. You know, and all those things that Drucker described very eloquently, really, in his analysis of the management of General Motors, because he was one of the few people they would even talk to. I mean, other than that, they were a camarilla. But he actually sort of managed to win their trust, so it's a pretty good historical record of what sort of Sloan was up to at General Motors. That stuff's dead. It's like deader than Nineveh. I mean, you couldn't anymore run a thing like that 1950s General Motors, and you could hire like Chinese navvies to like lay down rail across the western U.S. now. I mean, it's got nothing to do with contemporary business. You know, and contemporary business practice, if anything, reeks of the postmodern. And
but that's not here in the United States or Western Europe. That's over in China and India, and that's why they're reaping the benefits, because all those plants and everything where that was applied then had migrated to those places, and that's why they're wealthy.
Sort of, kind of, but the Chinese method is not a Fordist method, and it's certainly not like the GM Sloan thing. And I don't know. I mean, we could discuss it all night. We could discuss it for several weeks, really. But that's just one small fraction of society, and it's. I mean, one of the things I like best about the business dialogue is that it's so freaking superstitious and magical. And they claim to be sort of in touch with some very central bottom line reality, and they're just absolutely panic-driven people who almost never think to scientifically test any of their assertions. And they're really I don't know. They at the moment they're into what who the hell was that calling it there? Oh gosh, famous mogul referred to business as being occupied with lemming retention, right? I mean, we're in a business era of lemming retention where they're all leaping off the cliff and destroying incredible amounts of money. I mean, more than capitalism has made in centuries is being annihilated almost every night. And lemming retention is the practice of just trying to save a few, bail out a few structures that are still workable. I mean, that's not what Drucker had in mind, I don't know. There are strange overlaps between philosophy and business. Soros, real philosopher. You read like George Soros. He's written like 4 or 5 books. None of them are about being a rich guy. They're all about freaking philosophy. Karl Popper mostly, but he just goes on and on and on about it. Kind of astonishing. He's certainly not a scientist, but he's a philosopher in the markets, and that's why he's also a political activist and a guy who was all over Eastern Europe. Was in a one-man civil resuscitation factory out there. Well, thank you for hearing me.